He stood at the altar with two brides beside him, both weighing more than his prize bull, while the entire town watched in stunned silence. But this wasn't about love, and it wasn't about choice. This was about survival. 3 months earlier, Ezekiel Marsh had been a different man. The drought had claimed his cattle, the bank threatened his ranch, and his late wife's medical debts crushed him like a vice. He sat in Sterling Maddox's office, hat in his weathered hands, staring at papers that would strip away everything his family had built. "I have a proposition," Sterling said, his round face gleaming with sweat despite the cool morning air. "My daughter Magnolia needs a husband. So does Miss Willa Blaine, whose father owed me considerable money before his passing." Ezekiel's throat tightened. He'd seen both women around town. Magnolia rarely left her father's store, always hidden behind the counter. Willa lived alone on her inherited land, keeping to herself. Both carried extra weight that made other men look away, whispering cruel jokes behind their backs. "You marry them both," Sterling continued, sliding a contract across the mahogany desk. "I forgive your debts, give you seed money for next season, and you provide these women with the respect of marriage. Everyone benefits." The words hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. Marry 2 women he barely knew, women the town had written off as unmarriageable. His pride recoiled, but his empty stomach and the foreclosure notice in his pocket spoke louder. "This is legal?" Ezekiel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Territorial law allows it under specific circumstances. I've arranged everything." Sterling's smile was cold as winter steel. "You have until sunset to decide. After that, the bank takes your ranch tomorrow." Ezekiel walked out into the blazing noon sun, his mind spinning. The town's main street stretched before him like a gauntlet. Mrs. Henderson swept her porch, eyeing him with the look she reserved for wounded animals. 2 cowboys lounged outside the saloon, their laughter cutting through the air as they discussed his predicament. The weight of judgment pressed down on his shoulders. Everyone knew about his debts, his desperation. They were waiting to see how far he'd fall. But as he passed Maddox's store, he glimpsed Magnolia through the window. She was arranging fabric bolts with careful precision, her movements graceful despite her size. For just a moment their eyes met, and he saw something there that surprised him. Not shame or resignation, but a quiet strength that reminded him of mountain stone. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the dusty street, Ezekiel signed the contract. But what he didn't know was that both women had secrets that would change everything he thought he understood about marriage, dignity, and the true meaning of partnership. The wedding was set for the following week, giving Ezekiel barely enough time to comprehend what he'd agreed to. But Sterling Maddox was a man who moved fast when money was involved, and he'd already spread word through town that his daughter would finally be married. Ezekiel spent those days avoiding the curious stares and whispered conversations that followed him everywhere. When he entered the general store for supplies, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Children pointed until their mothers yanked them away. The weight of their judgment felt heavier than the debt that had driven him to this desperate choice. On Wednesday, he encountered Magnolia alone in her father's store. She was counting inventory, her thick fingers moving with surprising dexterity as she recorded numbers in a leather-bound ledger. When she noticed him, she didn't look away like most people expected her to. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. "I told my father I didn't need his charity arrangements." Ezekiel studied her profile. She had intelligent eyes and soft brown hair that caught the light streaming through the window. There was dignity in the way she held herself, despite everything. "Maybe I'm the one getting charity," he replied, surprising himself with the honesty. She glanced up then, searching his face for mockery. When she found none, something shifted in her expression. "Father says you have a good ranch, good land. That's worth more than most men bring to a marriage these days." Before he could respond, the door chimed and Willa Blaine entered. She was taller than Magnolia, with striking green eyes and auburn hair braided down her back. Unlike Magnolia, who dressed practically, Willa wore a faded but well-tailored dress that suggested better times. The 3 of them stood in awkward silence until Willa spoke. "I suppose we should discuss the arrangements. This situation is unusual enough without adding unnecessary confusion." Her voice carried the remnants of education, the kind that came from books and proper schooling. Ezekiel wondered what circumstances had brought her to accept Sterling's proposition. "I have my own cabin on my father's old land," Willa continued. "I can maintain my independence there. This marriage is a business arrangement, nothing more." Magnolia nodded slowly. "Father has prepared rooms above the store. I can stay there and help with his business." Ezekiel felt a strange disappointment at their practical words. He'd expected this to be purely transactional, but hearing them discuss it so matter-of-factly made something hollow echo in his chest. "What about the ranch?" he asked. "It's large enough for a family if anyone wanted to." "We're not a family," Willa interrupted, her voice sharp. "We're three people bound by legal documents and financial necessity. Let's not pretend otherwise." But as she spoke, Ezekiel noticed her hands trembling slightly, and he wondered if her harsh words were meant to convince him or herself. Something told him there was more to both these women than their carefully constructed walls revealed. The wedding was only 4 days away, and already he sensed that nothing about this arrangement would be as simple as Sterling Maddox had promised. The morning of the wedding arrived with unseasonable cold and gray skies that seemed to mirror the mood of everyone involved. Ezekiel stood before his cracked mirror, adjusting his only good shirt and wondering how his life had led to this moment. The ceremony would take place in the small church at the edge of town, with Reverend Walsh performing the unusual service. Sterling had insisted on making it a public affair, claiming it would legitimize the arrangement and silence any legal challenges later. As Ezekiel walked toward the church, he noticed clusters of townspeople gathering along the street. Some watched with open curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement. A few women shook their heads in disapproval, though whether they disapproved of him or the brides, he couldn't tell. Inside the church, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Sterling Maddox sat in the front pew, dressed in his finest suit and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd solved a complex business problem. Behind him, the church was fuller than it had been for any service in months. Magnolia entered first, wearing a simple blue dress that her mother had worn decades earlier. She moved with quiet grace down the aisle, her chin held high despite the whispers that followed her. When she reached the altar, she gave Ezekiel a small nod that seemed to say they were in this together, whatever it might bring. Willa came next, and Ezekiel's breath caught in his throat. She'd transformed herself for the occasion, wearing a deep green dress that complemented her eyes and auburn hair. She carried herself like royalty, her back straight and her gaze fixed straight ahead, ignoring the stares and whispered comments from the congregation. Reverend Walsh cleared his throat nervously as both women took their places beside Ezekiel. The old preacher had clearly never performed a ceremony like this, and he fumbled with his prayer book as he began the service. "Dearly beloved," he started, his voice cracking slightly, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Ezekiel Marsh to Magnolia Maddox and Willa Blaine in the bonds of matrimony." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Someone in the back pews laughed, quickly hushing when others turned to glare. Ezekiel felt heat rise in his cheeks, but when he glanced at his brides, both women stood with remarkable composure. As the ceremony progressed, Ezekiel found himself studying both women's faces. Magnolia's expression was serene, almost peaceful, as if she'd found some inner calm about the situation. Willa, however, seemed to be fighting some internal battle. Her jaw clenched, and her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. When the time came for vows, Reverend Walsh stumbled over the words, clearly unsure how to adapt traditional promises for such an unconventional arrangement. They settled on simple affirmations of commitment and respect, words that felt hollow in the echoing church. But as Ezekiel spoke his vows, looking first at Magnolia and then at Willa, something unexpected happened. In that moment, standing before the entire town that had judged them all, he felt a fierce protectiveness rise in his chest. These women had shown more courage than any of the people sitting in those pews, agreeing to bind their lives to a man they barely knew rather than live as objects of pity and scorn. "You may kiss the brides," Reverend Walsh announced, his voice barely above a whisper. The church fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the spectacle they'd come to witness. Ezekiel turned to Magnolia first, placing a gentle kiss on her cheek. She smiled softly, her eyes warm with gratitude. Then he turned to Willa, expecting the same formal gesture. But when his lips touched her cheek, she flinched as if struck, and for just an instant, he saw raw pain flash across her features before she composed herself again. As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wives, Ezekiel realized that whatever challenges lay ahead, the hardest part wasn't the unusual arrangement itself. It was the secrets both women were carrying, secrets that could either bind them together or tear their fragile new family apart. The reception took place in Sterling's store, hastily cleared of merchandise to accommodate tables and chairs borrowed from the church. The atmosphere was strained, with most guests attending out of curiosity rather than celebration. Ezekiel watched his new wives navigate the awkward conversations and barely concealed stares with remarkable dignity. Magnolia moved through the small crowd with practiced ease, having spent years managing her father's customers. She served cake and poured coffee, playing the perfect hostess despite the circumstances. Several women from town actually engaged her in genuine conversation, seeming to see her as a person rather than a spectacle for the first time. Willa, however, remained on the periphery, her elegant bearing creating an invisible barrier that few dared cross. When old Mrs. Patterson approached with what appeared to be well-meaning advice about marriage, Willa's polite but firm responses quickly ended the conversation. As the afternoon wore on, Ezekiel found himself watching both women with growing curiosity. There were layers to each of them that challenged his initial assumptions. Magnolia's quiet confidence suggested depths he hadn't expected, while Willa's careful control hinted at vulnerabilities she was determined to hide. Near sunset, the last guests departed, leaving the three of them to clean up the remnants of their strange wedding celebration. Sterling had retired to his office, satisfied that his business arrangement was complete. The silence stretched between them as they stacked chairs and gathered dishes. "I suppose we should discuss living arrangements," Willa said finally, removing her gloves with precise movements. "I meant what I said about maintaining my independence." Magnolia nodded, though Ezekiel noticed a flicker of disappointment cross her features. "Father expects me to continue helping with the store. I can stay in the rooms upstairs." Ezekiel felt an unexpected frustration building in his chest. "So we're married in name only? 3 separate lives that happen to share legal documents? What did you expect?" Willa's voice carried a sharp edge. "Romance? Love letters and moonlight walks? This was a business transaction, nothing more." But as she spoke, her hands trembled slightly, and Ezekiel caught something in her tone that suggested her harsh words were costing her something. "I expected honesty at least," he replied quietly. "Whatever brought each of us to this point, we're bound together now. We can make the best of it or let pride destroy any chance of finding something worthwhile." Magnolia looked up from the dishes she was washing. "What are you suggesting?" "Come to the ranch, both of you, for dinner tomorrow night. Let's try to be something more than strangers who happen to share a name." Willa straightened, her green eyes flashing. "I don't need charity dinners or forced friendships." "Neither do I," Ezekiel said, meeting her gaze directly. "But I do need to know the people I'm legally bound to. And despite what you might think, I suspect you both need the same thing." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. Magnolia dried her hands on her apron, glancing between them. "I'll come," she said softly. "If Willa agrees." All eyes turned to Willa, who stood frozen in internal conflict. Her carefully constructed walls were showing cracks, and Ezekiel could see the war between her pride and something deeper playing out across her features. "Fine," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "One dinner, but don't expect miracles." As they parted ways that evening, each heading to their separate dwellings, Ezekiel wondered what tomorrow would bring. He had a feeling that beneath the surface of this practical arrangement lay currents that could either drown them all or carry them towards something none of them had dared to hope for. Ezekiel spent the following day preparing for dinner with more care than he'd given to any meal since his first wife's death. He cleaned the ranch house thoroughly, arranged wildflowers in a mason jar, and prepared a simple but hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread. As evening approached, his nervousness surprised him. Magnolia arrived first, carrying a covered dish and wearing a clean apron over her everyday dress. She paused at the threshold, taking in the modest but well-maintained home. "It's lovely," she said, and he could tell she meant it. "You've kept it very nice." "My late wife Sarah had strong opinions about housekeeping," Ezekiel replied, accepting the dish she offered. "Old habits." Magnolia's expression softened. "How long has she been gone?" 2 years this fall. The fever took her quick. The word still came hard, but somehow telling Magnolia felt natural. "She would have liked you, I think. You have her way of making things feel peaceful." Before Magnolia could respond, they heard the sound of an approaching horse. Willa rode up on a beautiful chestnut mare, sitting her saddle with the kind of skill that spoke of years in the saddle. She'd changed from her wedding dress into practical riding clothes, but she still carried herself with that unmistakable dignity. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Ezekiel said as he helped her dismount. Neither was I, Willa admitted, her honesty surprising them both. The dinner started awkwardly, with stilted conversation about the weather and ranch business. But as the evening progressed and the wine Willa had brought loosened their tongues, genuine conversation began to emerge. "You ride like you were born in the saddle," Ezekiel observed, as Willa described her journey to the ranch. "My father insisted I learn everything about ranch work," she replied, a shadow crossing her face. "He said a woman who owned land needed to understand every aspect of it." "Owned?" Magnolia asked gently. Willa hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "My father left me 300 acres and a considerable debt. When he died last year, I discovered he'd borrowed heavily against the land. Sterling Maddox held most of those debts." The pieces began falling into place for Ezekiel. "So this marriage saves my land and eliminates my debt, just like it saved your ranch." Willa's voice was matter-of-fact, but her hands clenched around her wine glass. "We're both products of financial desperation. Mr. Marsh, let's not pretend otherwise." Magnolia had grown quiet during this exchange, and when they both looked at her expectantly, she seemed to shrink into herself. "What about you?" Ezekiel asked gently. "What brought you to accept your father's arrangement?" Magnolia's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands. "You wouldn't understand." "Try us," Willa said, her voice surprisingly kind. "I'm 28 years old," Magnolia said quietly. "I've spent my entire life behind the counter of my father's store, watching other women marry and have families while men look right through me. Father says no man would choose me willingly, that my only value is in the dowry he can provide." The raw pain in her voice hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. He saw Willa's expression soften as well, understanding passing between the two women. "Your father is a fool," Willa said firmly. "Any man who can't see past the surface doesn't deserve what you have to offer." Magnolia looked up in surprise, tears glistening in her eyes. "You really mean that?" "I do." Willa reached across the table and took Magnolia's hand. "We've all been judged by appearances and found wanting. Maybe it's time we stopped accepting other people's valuations of our worth." Ezekiel watched this exchange with growing amazement. These women, whom the town had written off as unmarriageable burdens, were revealing themselves to be complex, intelligent, and infinitely more valuable than the shallow judgments placed upon them. As the evening wound down, a comfortable silence settled over the three of them. For the first time since signing Sterling's contract, Ezekiel began to wonder if this arrangement might become something more than mere survival. But just as that hope took root, Willa stiffened, her expression closing off again. "Thank you for dinner," she said formally, rising from her chair. "But we shouldn't mistake one pleasant evening for something it's not." As she prepared to leave, Ezekiel couldn't shake the feeling that Willa was running from something that scared her more than financial ruin or social judgment. And until he understood what that was, their fragile new bond would remain as precarious as a house built on shifting sand. Over the following weeks, an unexpected routine developed between the three of them. Magnolia would visit the ranch twice a week, often bringing supplies from her father's store and staying to help with household tasks. Her presence brought a warmth to the place that Ezekiel hadn't realized he'd been missing. Willa remained more distant, but she began stopping by occasionally when her ranch work brought her near his property line. She would accept coffee and conversation, but always maintained her careful boundaries, never staying past sunset. It was during one of these visits that Ezekiel discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about Willa Blaine. He'd been mending fence near the creek when he heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking up, he saw Willa riding hard toward his property. But she wasn't alone. 3 men followed close behind. And even from a distance, Ezekiel could see this wasn't a friendly social call. Willa's mare was lathered with sweat as she pulled up near where Ezekiel worked. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set with determination. "Whatever they say to you, don't believe them," she said quickly, glancing back at the approaching riders. The 3 men rode up with the swagger of men accustomed to intimidating others. The leader, a heavy-set man with greasy hair and cold eyes, dismounted and spat in the dust. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying a nasty undertone. "If it isn't Mrs. Marsh, though I suppose I should say one of the misses." "Marshes, shouldn't I?" Ezekiel stepped protectively closer to Willa, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped against a fence post. "State your business. Name's Pike. These here are my associates. We've come to collect what's owed us." "I don't owe you anything," Ezekiel replied evenly. Pike's laugh was ugly. Not you, friend. Her. He pointed a dirty finger at Willa. See, before she became your respectable wife. Miss Willa here had some debts of her own. Debts that don't just disappear because she found herself a husband. Willa's face had gone completely white, but she held her ground. I told you before, Pike, I don't have the money. I never had the money. That's where you're wrong, sweetheart. Your new husband here must have some assets. That's a nice ranch. Good land. Should cover what you owe with interest. Ezekiel felt a cold anger building in his chest. What exactly does she supposedly owe you? Pike's grin revealed yellowed teeth. Gambling debts. Your wife here has expensive tastes when it comes to card games. Lost big in a game about 6 months back. We've been patient, but patience has its limits. That's a lie, Willa said, her voice shaking with rage rather than fear. I never gambled with you or anyone else. You calling me a liar? Pike's hand moved to rest on his gun butt. Because I've got witnesses say otherwise, and the law tends to believe men with witnesses over women with stories. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Ezekiel could see the trap these men had laid. In a territory where women had few legal protections, and a man's word carried more weight than truth, they could destroy Willa's reputation and claim whatever they wanted. But as Ezekiel studied Pike's face, he saw something the man probably didn't realize he was revealing. This wasn't about gambling debts or money. This was personal. The way Pike looked at Willa, the hunger in his eyes, told a different story entirely. Get off my land, Ezekiel said quietly, his voice carrying a steel edge that made Pike's companions shift nervously in their saddles. Pike's expression hardened. We'll be back, Marsh. And next time, we'll bring the sheriff. Think about whether your new wife is worth losing everything you've worked for. As the 3 men rode away, Ezekiel turned to find Willa staring after them with an expression that mixed fear and fury in equal measure. It's not what you think, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then tell me what it is, Ezekiel replied gently. Because whatever hold they think they have over you, we'll face it together. But even as he spoke the words, he could see Willa withdrawing again, her walls rebuilding themselves stone by stone. Whatever secret she was protecting, it was big enough that she'd rather face Pike's threats alone than trust her new husband with the truth. That evening, Ezekiel rode to Sterling Maddox's store with more questions than answers burning in his mind. He found Magnolia alone, closing up for the day, her father having retired early with another of his frequent headaches that seemed to coincide with difficult conversations. I need to ask you about Willa, Ezekiel said without preamble. What do you know about her past? Magnolia's hands stilled on the ledger she was balancing. Why? What's happened? Ezekiel told her about Pike's visit and the claims about gambling debts. As he spoke, he watched Magnolia's expression shift from confusion to something that looked like recognition. Gambling debts, she repeated slowly. No, that's not right. Willa doesn't gamble. But what? Magnolia glanced toward the stairs leading to her father's quarters, then lowered her voice. About a year ago, before her father died, there were rumors. Talk about Willa and some trouble in the next county over. Father wouldn't tell me the details, said it wasn't proper for me to know such things. What kind of trouble? The kind that makes a woman leave her home in the middle of the night and never speak of where she came from. Magnolia's eyes were troubled. Father said her father brought her here to start fresh, that whatever happened before was behind them. But if these men have followed her, Ezekiel felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, none of them forming a picture he liked. Where can I find out more about what happened? Mrs. Patterson might know. She has family in every county for 200 miles, and she keeps track of every scandal that's ever happened. Magnolia hesitated. But Ezekiel, if you start digging into Willa's past, you might find things that change how you see her. She's my wife, he said simply. Whatever she's running from, she doesn't have to run alone anymore. The next morning, Ezekiel found Mrs. Patterson hanging laundry behind her boarding house. The elderly woman was known for her sharp tongue and sharper memory, and she'd never met a piece of gossip she couldn't improve with elaborate detail. Willa Blaine, she said, pausing with a wet sheet in her hands. Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in months, though I suppose it's Mrs. Marsh now, isn't it? What do you know about her past? Mrs. Patterson? The old woman's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who finally had a captive audience for information she'd been sitting on. Came from Cedar Ridge County, she did. Her father owned a big spread over there. Successful man by all accounts. But something happened, something that made them pack up and leave everything behind. What kind of something? Mrs. Patterson glanced around as if enemies might be listening, then leaned closer. Word was she was engaged to be married. Fellow named Marcus Pike, had money and connections. Big wedding planned, the whole county invited. Ezekiel's blood ran cold. Pike, the same last name as the man who'd threatened them yesterday. What happened to the engagement? That's where the stories get interesting, Mrs. Patterson continued, clearly enjoying herself. Some say she ran off with another man the night before the wedding. Others say she killed someone and had to flee. But my cousin Martha, who lived in Cedar Ridge then, she always said the girl looked like she'd been through hell when they left town. Looked how? Mrs. Patterson's expression grew more serious. Like someone who'd been hurt bad and was still healing. Martha said she saw bruises on her arms when she helped load their wagon. Said the girl flinched every time a man came near her. The picture forming in Ezekiel's mind made his stomach turn. A powerful man, a woman who tried to escape, and threats that followed her even after she'd found refuge in marriage to another. This Marcus Pike, Ezekiel said carefully. What happened to him? Oh, he's still there, still unmarried. Martha says he never got over being left at the altar. Still talks about Willa like she's his property, like she'll come back when she's done playing games. Ezekiel thanked Mrs. Patterson and rode back toward his ranch with his mind racing. The man who'd threatened them yesterday wasn't just some criminal looking for easy money. He was a spurned lover who believed he had a claim on Willa, and men like that didn't give up easily. As he topped the rise near his property, he saw smoke rising from the direction of Willa's cabin. Not the thin smoke of a cooking fire, but the thick, dark smoke of something burning that shouldn't be. He spurred his horse forward, a cold dread settling in his chest. Pike had said they'd be back, but Ezekiel hadn't expected it to be this soon. As he rode hard toward Willa's property, he could only hope he wasn't already too late. Ezekiel reached Willa's property to find her barn engulfed in flames, but the cabin remained untouched. He spotted Willa standing in her yard, rifle in hand, facing down Marcus Pike and his two companions, who sat their horses just beyond weapon range. "Willa!" Ezekiel called out as he dismounted, drawing his own rifle. Pike turned with a cold smile. "Well, if it isn't the husband, come to collect your property?" "She's not property," Ezekiel said, moving to stand beside Willa. "She's my wife, and you're trespassing." "Your wife?" Pike laughed harshly. "You think some piece of paper changes what she is? What she owes me?" Willa's voice was steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I never owed you anything, Marcus. I never agreed to marry you, and I never will. You left me standing at the altar in front of the whole county," Pike snarled, his facade of calm cracking. "Made me look like a fool. Do you know what that cost me?" "Less than what staying would have cost me," Willa replied. And for the first time since Ezekiel had known her, her voice carried no fear, only cold determination. Pike's face darkened. "You always were too proud for your own good. But pride doesn't keep a woman safe when she's all alone." "She's not alone," Ezekiel said quietly. At that moment, he heard approaching hoofbeats and turned to see Magnolia riding up with Sheriff Henderson and 3 deputies. Magnolia had clearly anticipated trouble and taken action. The sight of law enforcement seemed to deflate Pike's companions, but Pike himself only smiled wider. "Sheriff," he called out. "Perfect timing. I was just explaining to these folks about the outstanding debts owed to me." Sheriff Henderson, a fair man who'd known Ezekiel for years, dismounted slowly. "What kind of debts, Pike?" "Breach of promise," Pike said smoothly. "Miss Blaine here was legally engaged to marry me. When she fled, she cost me considerable money in wedding preparations and damaged my reputation. I'm entitled to compensation." "That's a civil matter," Henderson replied. "And last I checked, Willa Blaine is now Mrs. Marsh. Whatever agreements existed before her marriage are no longer valid." Pike's mask finally slipped completely. "She belongs to me. I found her first. I claimed her first." "Nobody belongs to anybody," Willa said, stepping forward. Her voice carried a strength that made everyone present turn to look at her. "I left Cedar Ridge because you couldn't accept that a woman has the right to say no. You tried to force me into marriage, and when I refused, you made my life hell until my father and I had to flee." "You're lying," Pike said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Willa pulled back her sleeve, revealing faded but still visible scars on her forearm. "These are from the night you decided to show me what would happen if I didn't obey. That's when I knew I had to leave. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the burning barn. Sheriff Henderson's expression had grown very serious. "Pike, you and your men are going to leave this county and not come back. If I see you on this side of the territorial line again, I'll arrest you for harassment and destruction of property." As Pike and his companions rode away, defeated, Willa finally lowered her rifle. Ezekiel saw tears streaming down her face, but for the first time since he'd known her, they seemed to be tears of relief rather than pain. "It's over," she whispered. Magnolia dismounted and put her arms around Willa, offering the comfort of sisterhood. Ezekiel watched his two wives console each other and felt something shift permanently in his chest. This wasn't the business arrangement Sterling Maddox had crafted. This was a family, forged not by law or money, but by the choice to stand together when it mattered most. In the months that followed, the three of them built something unprecedented in their small town. Willa moved to the ranch, bringing her livestock and her hard-won independence. Magnolia split her time between helping her father and creating a home with them. The town eventually stopped staring and started accepting that some families are built on foundations stronger than convention. Ezekiel had entered into marriage expecting survival. Instead, he found something far more valuable: two remarkable women who had taught him that love isn't always what you expect, but it's always worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.